The house had stood in quiet elegance for years, nestled in a peaceful Los Angeles neighborhood. A Spanish-style home with arched doorways and sunlit courtyards, it had once belonged to Christian Oliver, the German-born actor whose career spanned Hollywood blockbusters and European cinema. But after his tragic death in a plane crash alongside his two daughters, the house remained empty, its walls holding on to whispers of the past. When the Martinez family moved in during the summer of 2024, they saw only beauty in its design, unaware of the sorrow lingering within its walls. Maria and Carlos Martinez had long dreamed of owning a home in California, and with their children, Sofia and Diego, they were eager to start fresh. At first, it was small things barely noticeable. The kitchen lights flickered when Maria prepared dinner. A shadow moved in the hallway just outside Diego's room, vanishing when he turned his head. The old wooden doors, swollen from the heat, seemed to open and close on their own. One evening, as Sofia lay in bed scrolling through her phone, she heard it. Laughter soft, distant, unmistakably that of a child. She froze, the sound sending chills through her. She ran to her parents' room, breathless, but they reassured her it was probably the neighbors. Yet, when Maria stepped into the hallway later that night, she too heard it, the light, joyful giggles of children playing somewhere they shouldn't be. Carlos remained skeptical, but the disturbances grew harder to ignore. Doors slammed with no wind to push them. The family's dog, Luna, barked at empty corners, her tail low between her legs. A faint scent of lavender and ocean salt sometimes filled the air, unexplainable in a home far from the sea. Curious and unsettled, Maria did some research on their home's history. It didn't take long before she found the article's Christian Oliver, the actor who once lived here, had died in a crash alongside his daughters. The realization struck like cold water. Determined to find peace, the Martinez family decided to honor the spirits they now believed resided within their home. In the backyard, they planted 3 trees, one for Christian, one for Medita, and one for Anik. Maria whispered their names as she watered the soil, offering quiet prayers of remembrance. After that night, the house grew still. The laughter faded. The lights no longer flickered. The doors remained closed unless opened by a living hand. It was as if the spirits had finally found rest. Now, when the Martinez family sits in their courtyard, they feel warmth rather than unease. And sometimes, on the windiest evenings, the rustling leaves of the 3 trees sound almost like a whisper, a gentle farewell. The days stretched into weeks, and with each passing moment, the Martinez family settled deeper into the rhythms of their new home. The house, once restless with unseen movements and whispered echoes, now exhaled a stillness that wrapped around them like a long-forgotten lullaby. The trees in the backyard, young and fragile, their roots just beginning to take hold, swayed gently in the breeze, their slender branches casting dappled shadows on the worn brick patio. Maria often sat there in the early mornings, cradling a cup of coffee in her hands, watching as the first rays of sunlight spilled over the tiled rooftops and bathed the house in golden light. And yet, beneath this newfound peace, an unease still lingered, faint but persistent, like a thread of cold air slipping through a closed window. It was not fear, exactly, rather, it was the sense of being watched, not with malice, but with the quiet intensity of someone waiting, someone who had not yet finished telling their story. One evening, as the last light of day melted into the deep blue of twilight, Sofia sat curled in the corner of the living room, a book open in her lap. The room was quiet except for the occasional rustle of pages and the muffled laughter of Diego playing outside. Maria was in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she washed the dinner dishes, and Carlos sat at the dining table, flipping through his phone. It was an ordinary evening, no different from the ones before it, until Sofia glanced up and noticed the old mirror hanging on the far wall. It had come with the house, a tall, antique thing framed in dark mahogany, its surface warped ever so slightly with age. In the dim light, it reflected the room back at her, the flickering glow of the lamp, the soft curve of the couch, the distant blur of her mother moving in the kitchen. But something was off. The reflection was slower, just a breath behind reality, as if time inside the mirror moved at its own, deliberate pace. She narrowed her eyes, her fingers tightening around the book in her hands. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, something shifting in the farthest corner of the glass, a ripple in the shadows. But when she blinked, it was gone. Sophia hesitated, then stood, her bare feet silent against the cool wooden floor. Step by step, she approached the mirror, her reflection growing clearer, sharper, until she was close enough to see the fine details of her own face, the stray strands of hair curling at her temples, the faint shadow of a bruise on her knee from an earlier fall. She reached out, pressing her fingertips to the glass. It was cool, solid, normal, and yet, just as she was about to pull away, the air shifted. A faint breath of something not quite wind, not quite warmth brushed against her cheek. A whisper, too soft to hear, barely more than a sigh. Sophia yelped and stumbled back, nearly knocking over the small wooden table beside her. Carlos looked up, startled, while Maria wiped her hands on a dish towel and hurried over. What happened? Maria's voice was gentle but firm, her eyes scanning Sophia's face. I thought I saw something, Sophia stammered, glancing back at the mirror. But now, it reflected only what it should: her own wide-eyed face, her mother's concerned expression, the warm glow of the room behind them. No delay, no shadow. Carlos chuckled, shaking his head. Maybe you need to stop reading all those horror books before bed. Sophia tried to smile, but her fingers were still tingling from where they had touched the glass. She swallowed and turned away, telling herself it had been nothing, just a trick of the light, a tired mind playing games. But later that night, as she lay in bed with the covers pulled up to her chin, she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the house, someone was still watching. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The house exhaled a deep, slow stillness, wrapping itself around the Martinez family as the night settled in. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, their young branches bending and swaying as if murmuring to one another. The air was thick with the scent of warm earth and jasmine, the fragrance drifting in through the open windows, mixing with the lingering traces of dinner garlic, cumin, the faintest hint of toasted bread. Sophia lay beneath her blanket, her body curled toward the wall, her fingers gripping the edge of the fabric like a lifeline. The room was quiet, save for the occasional creak of settling wood, the steady ticking of the clock on her nightstand. And yet, no matter how she tried to convince herself otherwise, she could not shake the feeling that something was still watching. It was an ache just beneath her ribs, a prickling sensation at the base of her skull that refused to fade. The mirror's reflection burned in her mind, the way it had lagged behind, just slightly out of sync, like a breath caught in hesitation. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing the memory away, but it clung to her, persistent as the shadows in the corners of the room. Minutes stretched into hours. The night deepened, and the house fell into a silence so absolute it felt unnatural, as though even the walls were holding their breath. Somewhere down the hall, she could hear the muffled hum of the refrigerator, the occasional sigh of shifting pipes, and then, a sound, soft, barely there, a rustle, a whisper of fabric moving against wood. Sophia's eyes snapped open. The room was dark, the only illumination coming from the street lamp outside, its dim orange glow spilling through the slatted blinds. She turned her head slowly, her breath caught in her throat. Nothing, just the familiar shapes of her dresser, her desk, the chair draped with the hoodie she had tossed there earlier. And then, a creak. Long, slow, deliberate. Not the sound of a house settling. Not the random shift of cooling wood. A footstep. Sophia froze. It was outside her door. For a moment, she could not move, could not breathe. The darkness felt heavier now, thick and pressing, curling around her like unseen hands. Then, another step. Soft, slow. A shadow moved beneath the door. Sophia's breath came in short, shallow bursts. She pulled the blanket up to her chin, her heart hammering so violently she was certain whatever was outside could hear it. The doorknob rattled, just slightly, not as if someone were trying to open it. No, it was too subtle for that. It was a touch, a brush of fingers. Testing. Her throat closed around a scream she could not release. Then nothing. The silence stretched. 1 second. 2. 3. A full minute passed. Sophia lay rigid, waiting, listening, the shadows pressing in around her. And then so faint she almost convinced herself she had imagined it, she heard it. A whisper, right outside her door. One word. Her name. Sophia. The sound barely existed, just a breath. A sigh. But it carried through the stillness, curling through the darkness like mist over water. Sophia's body went cold. She shut her eyes, clenched them tight, her fingers digging into the blanket, her breath shallow, uneven. She did not move, could not. The night stretched long, endless, suffocating. And then, just before sleep finally, mercifully, pulled her under, she heard it again, soft, lingering, carried on a phantom breeze that should not have existed. A child's laughter, distant, fading, and then silence. The morning light bled into the room slowly, like watercolor seeping across a damp canvas, painting the walls in hues of pale gold and gray. Sophia stirred beneath her blankets, her limbs heavy, her head thick with the weight of restless sleep. The whisper still clung to her, tangled in the cobwebs of her memory, her name, spoken in a breath of air too cold, too deliberate. The sound of it had curled around her like fingers in the dark, and now, even in the daylight, she could still feel its presence, a faint pressure at the base of her skull. She sat up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, and glanced at the door. It was closed, just as she had left it. The shadows beneath it were empty, void of movement, as though nothing had ever stood there in the night. But something had. The thought sent a shudder rippling through her. For a long moment, she remained still, listening. The house was alive with the sounds of morning, distant footsteps padding down the hall, the low murmur of voices from the kitchen, the clatter of plates. The world was moving again, shaking off the stillness of the night, and yet Sophia felt as though she were trapped beneath it, still tangled in the echoes of something unseen. Finally, she pushed back the blankets and swung her legs over the edge of the bed. Her feet met the cool wood floor, sending a small shock through her body, and she stood, stretching, rolling the stiffness from her shoulders. She told herself it had been a dream, just a fragment of some half-formed nightmare that had lingered too long. She had been tired, that was all. The mind played tricks in the dark. But as she turned toward her dresser, something made her stop. The mirror. She had left it covered. She was sure of it. After last night, after the way its reflection had lagged, the way she had seen movement in its depths, she had thrown a blanket over it before climbing into bed, needing to shut it out, to hide its warped, whispering glass. But now the blanket was on the floor, crumpled in a heap at the base of the frame. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She had not touched it. The air in the room felt different now, charged, humming with something she could not name. The mirror stood tall against the wall, its dark mahogany frame polished to a dull shine, its surface smooth, pristine. But as Sophia stared at it, her pulse hammering against her ribs, she could not shake the feeling that it was watching her. The reflection was normal. The dresser, the posters on the wall, the soft folds of her unmade bed. And yet, the longer she looked, the more a sickening certainty twisted inside her. Something was wrong. Her own image stared back at her, her hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders, the faded t-shirt wrinkled from sleep. But the air behind her in the reflection seemed heavier, almost thicker, like mist rising in the early morning. And then, as she watched, her stomach folding in on itself, her reflection blinked. A fraction of a second too late. Sophia stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Her heart pounded against her ribs, wild, erratic. No, 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 no. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to breathe, to think, to shove down the panic clawing its way up her throat. When she opened them again, the reflection was normal, perfectly in sync, perfectly still. Had she imagined it? She stepped forward, hesitantly, her fingers twitching at her sides. Slowly, cautiously, she raised a hand. Her reflection did the same at the exact same moment. No delay, no hesitation. Her skin prickled, but she forced herself to exhale, to shake off the unease slithering through her. Just a trick of the light. Just exhaustion. She reached down, grabbed the fallen blanket, and draped it back over the mirror, her movements brisk, deliberate. Then, without looking back, she turned and left the room. But as she walked down the hall toward the kitchen, the wooden floor cool against her bare feet, she could not escape the feeling that something remained behind her. Something standing just beyond the surface of the glass. Something waiting. The days passed, slow and uneasy. Though the house was warm with sunlight and filled with the normal sounds of life, the murmur of Carlos watching the news, the scrape of Maria's knife against a cutting board, the rhythmic tapping of Diego's fingers on his video game controller, Sofia could not shake the feeling that something had changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but she could feel it, like the weight of unseen eyes pressing into her back when she walked down the hall, like the hushed whispers she thought she heard when she was alone. She tried to ignore it. She avoided looking at the mirror. She told herself it had been her imagination, that exhaustion could do strange things to the mind. But the house was restless. It creaked and sighed at odd hours, and at night, shadows stretched too long, spilling into spaces they had no right to reach. Then, one evening, everything changed. The family had gathered in the living room, sprawled across the couch and floor, the television playing an old movie none of them were truly watching. Maria had fallen asleep with a blanket draped over her. Diego sat cross-legged with his tablet, and Carlos rested with his arm tucked behind his head. The warm glow of the lamp cast soft pools of light over the room, wrapping them in the comfort of routine. But Sofia couldn't relax. Something felt wrong. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the silence, a little too deep between the sounds of the TV, or the way the air felt thick, pressing against her skin like static before a storm. She shifted, glancing toward the darkened hallway, and that was when she saw it. The figure, standing at the far end of the hall, barely more than a silhouette in the dim light. Small, still, watching. Sofia's breath hitched. The shape was that of a child too short to be her father, too thin to be her brother. It stood motionless, its edges blurring against the shadows, its presence humming in the air like a silent scream. And then, it moved. Not walked, not stepped. It slid. Closer. Sofia's body locked in place, her limbs numb with cold. Her fingers dug into the couch cushion, but no sound escaped her lips. The figure inched forward, its form shifting, unnatural, as though the darkness itself was coiling and unfolding around it. Her throat clenched, a whimper caught just behind her teeth. She wanted to call out to her mother, her father, anyone, but fear had wrapped itself around her lungs, squeezing. The figure stopped just at the edge of the light, and then, with slow, deliberate motion, its head tilted. The gesture was wrong, too slow, too precise. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, soft, sweet, childlike, it spoke. Sofia. She couldn't move. The word curled through the air, weaving itself into the silence, wrapping around her name like a question, like a secret meant only for her. And then, took another step. The light did not touch it. The room seemed to shrink, the edges closing in, the air thick with something ancient, something wrong. Sofia squeezed her eyes shut. No, she whispered, though she did not know to whom she spoke. And then, the lights flickered. A gust of air, cold, unnatural, swept through the room. And when she dared to look again, the figure was gone. The hallway was empty. Only shadows remained. But something had changed. The house exhaled, as if satisfied. And somewhere, just faintly, in the silence that followed, a child's laughter echoed through the walls. The laughter lingered, stretching through the silence, curling through the house like a wisp of fog before fading into nothingness. Sofia sat frozen, her breath shallow, her fingers numb where they gripped the couch cushion. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, a frantic drum against the suffocating quiet. She turned her head slowly, her gaze flickering toward her family, her mother, still sleeping, undisturbed beneath her blanket. Her father, eyes half closed, unaware. Diego, staring at his tablet, oblivious. None of them had seen it. None of them had heard the whisper, the laughter, the presence that had loomed in the hallway just moments before. Sophia swallowed hard, her throat dry. Had it really been there? Or had the house finally twisted itself into the corners of her mind, making her question what was real? She wanted to believe it was nothing, a trick of the shadows, the weight of exhaustion pressing too hard against her thoughts. But deep down, in the pit of her stomach, she knew the truth. It was not over. It had only begun. The house was watching, waiting, and somewhere, in the unseen spaces between walls and reflections, something else was waiting too. Something with no face. Something that knew her name. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.